Today on CityCast Chicago, you're probably going to hear a lot of this over the weekend.
I have a dream. My poor little children one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
But you might be hearing less of this.
The time is always right to do what is right. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to transform the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man into a glowing daybreak of freedom and justice. Now is the time to open the doors of opportunity to all of God's children. Now is the time to change the pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherly love.
That's from a speech Martin Luther King Jr. gave in Chicago while he was here on the West Side fighting against housing discrimination. We're revisiting a conversation with the local historian about King's legacy right here in the land. It's Thursday, January 16th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago is talking about. Last year, executive producer Simone Alicea sat down with Tammy Gibson, a historian and author who focuses on Black history.
Tammy, welcome to CityCast Chicago.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
So I'm curious, before we get into what Dr. King actually did here, how well do you think Chicagoans know Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy here?
I think a lot of people know about what he did with the March on Washington, the jail in Birmingham, Alabama. But a lot of people tend to not really delve and know about the history of Martin Luther King. You know, when he did the I Have a Dream speech, everybody focuses at the end, right? When we all come together, black and white, you know, the content of our character, people really don't read or listen to the whole entirety. And he pretty much talked about the disenfranchisements and the issues that the Black community has gone through.
Well, and that disenfranchisement was felt very deeply here in Chicago when Dr. King came in 1966. Why did he come here at that time? What was the goal and what was he working on?
Well, actually, it was Al Raby. He was a teacher and he was the co-founder of the Chicago Freedom Movement. He saw Dr. King with the success of the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And he actually reached out to Dr. King to see if he can come to Chicago and deal with the issues pertaining to the Black community. And at that time, it was restrictive covenant and also slums, landlord slums, where during the Great Migration, thousands of African Americans came to Chicago, leaving the segregated South and the racism and the lynchings to Chicago for better opportunities, economic opportunities. But when they came down here, they were only restricted in certain areas, which was called redlining. And they weren't able to live in white neighborhoods. Or if they tried to, sign a lease or fill an application, they were turned down, because of the color of their skin. So Mr. Al Raby, contacted Dr. King and asked him if he'd come down to Chicago and, see what he can do to help with those issues.
And Dr. King came with his family, moved into a home in North Lawndale on the west side to help with this work. You mentioned the Chicago Freedom Movement. Can you say more about who was involved in the Freedom Movement and sort of how long they had been, working in Chicago? Kind of what was the Freedom Movement here about?
You have Dorothy Tillman, you had Jesse Jackson Jr., you had Timeo Black, you had Reverend Claude Wynette, you had Addie Wyatt. And pretty much they were doing this even before. Same issues that were happening in the South. A lot of people think that there was no racism or anything in the North, but I think it was more worse than it was in the South. So they were doing this, all these, the freedom rides and the segregation, the Woolworth counters that happened here in Chicago. So they were pretty much doing the same thing in the South as well, and the North.
when we're looking back with our modern lenses, right, we tend to think that like, oh, it was really, really, really bad in the South, right? And like that we up here in the North, maybe things were a little more equal or things were a little bit better. But we know that that wasn't the reality. I mean, Dr. King said that himself while he was here in Chicago, right?
I mean, I have friends. I'm not sharing my age. I was born in 1968. So I was born a couple of months after King was assassinated. And I have friends that are maybe 4 or 5 years older than me or 6 years older than me and remember where they couldn't walk to, where they couldn't cross during that time, like Bridgeport. There's another Mount Greenwood. Those are just some of the areas where they were not even allowed to even cross over. And people think that this happened 100 years ago, and this has happened. I'm 55 years old. That it didn't happen that far, and we're still facing some of those issues today. We're still dealing with loans for African Americans. What happened after the riots when King was assassinated, if you look today, there's still vacant lots from what happened during that time. And I think Dr. King felt like he was defeated, but I think that he pretty much opened everyone's eyes of what was going on. And that led to the Fair Housing Act in 1968. And then with the slumlords, now there's laws put in place for renters, that they can report that back during that time. African Americans didn't have that opportunity to tell on their landlords about the slum conditions that they were living in.
What were the challenges that he and members of the Chicago Freedom Movement faced as they fought against housing discrimination?
Well, one of the challenges was dealing with the violence, stepping outside. Dr. King, when he came in, of course, there were a lot of people that were happy that were there for, there to help with those issues. But the racial violence that he said that the hatred and the vitriol was way worse in the North than it is in the South. And then meeting with Daddy Daley. He went to City Hall and had these, things he wanted done. And Daddy Daley said they was going to work on it. And actually, he didn't.
Can you say more about the relationship between King and former Mayor Richard J. Daley? There was sort of an agreement that was in place that, Chicago was going to address some of these issues in housing, and then nothing materialized until we got the federal legislation a few years later.
Right. So, I mean, Dr. King met, Daddy Daley. He thought everything was good. And he told him what he wanted. He wanted African Americans to get loans to purchase homes, restricted covenants where African Americans can go to any black-white neighborhood and live. And it fell short. And Dr. King, was shocked because he's like, we had these conversations. He was with open arms and willing to help. And pretty much that didn't happen.
What was Dr. King's response when he encountered this resistance here?
To me, reading his bio and doing the research, he felt like it was not going to be as bad as it was in the South. But he said it was way 10 times worse than the North than he had even thought about and imagined in the South.
How did Black communities in Chicago respond to King's presence in the city?
Some were very welcoming when he came, and people found out he was living on the 3rd floor on South Lawndale. They came up there because they couldn't believe that he was actually there. So there were some people that were happy, but there were people that felt like it would be a distraction, that we're already going through racial tension already. And with him coming here, only going to be here for a year or so, but then he's going to go back, and then they have to deal with all the ramifications of that. So not everybody was happy that he came.
What's so interesting too is I think about what happened to the apartment that he was living in after he left. Can you tell? You're nodding your head because you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, so whenever I'm on the West Side, I always make myself a point just to pass by it. So it's called the MLK Legacy Apartment. And it's actually for low housing. And they also have like a little museum on the main floor where you can go in and learn about the history of Dr. King living there and the Chicago Freedom Movement. So I would encourage anybody to stop by there and see it.
How is King's legacy from his time here still felt in Chicago today?
I think it's still felt because we still have the elders that were part of the movement that tells his story, every King Day and around the same time that happened with the Chicago Freedom Movement. But honestly, there needs to be more. There needs to be, our children need to be educated about the history of Dr. King. Every year, I take some young people over to the MLK Memorial in Market Park. And it's a monument, and it talks about Dr. King walking down these streets in 1966 and getting beaten and thrown with rocks, about the history of Market Park and Garfield as well. So I think there needs to be more about Chicago, because like I said, they only talk about the March on Washington, mostly the March on Washington, but there needs to be more education about his contributions to Chicago.
I also think about, too, just the fact that we are still today dealing with segregation in housing and housing discrimination and the ramifications of what that has meant. I think particularly on the West Side where King stayed. And it's interesting because when you talk to folks living on the West Side, they'll bring that up to you, right? They will say, like, this is why Dr. King was here. This is why he marched here.
Right. And I drive in those areas every day. And I'm not saying that, there has been progress, but we got a long way to go. We still have the same issues on the South and West Side where there's food deserts. There's not a garden. Every corner is a gas station where people have to go to purchase food. So there's nothing for our children to eat healthy. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
When we talk about sort of what is known about King's legacy here, why do you think it gets less attention than, say, the March on Washington?
I think because people don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I just people don't know, because I tell people when I talk about the Chicago Freedom Movement, a lot of people just don't know. They don't know that he was here.
But I guess, like, what is perpetuating the lack of knowledge? And I mean, I'll put forward my theory is just that it wasn't, frankly, it wasn't that successful, like kind of in time while he was here.
True, because he felt that way. But he also said a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one single step. So I don't know if people think that he was supposed to come there and, wipe away everything. Everything that you do, you fight for, it takes time. For me, sometimes I feel like that part of history that they don't want to talk about, because sometimes it sheds a bad light. People don't want to talk. They want to talk about the good, but they don't want to talk about, they want to talk about the March on Washington, but they don't want to talk about him coming to Chicago and tackle the issues pertaining to the Black community. Because every event I go to, they do the I Have a Dream speech. Mm-hmm. That's it. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh my God, there's so much more to it. And so that's how I feel that there needs to be more. Our children, like I said, talk beyond the March on Washington, have them do a paper or learn about the unsung people that were behind the scenes that helped make Dr. King the person that he was and is today. And then also a day of service, go out to your community to beautify it. I know a lot of people, depending on the weather, because it's supposed to be really cold next week, they plan on cleaning up their community, or go to a park district and talk to the children about Dr. King. And, they can be great and, influence our young people to be great as well. So a lot of people are doing a lot of service community as well.
Any other stops in Chicago? You mentioned the memorial and the former apartment. Where else you might recommend Chicagoans go to honor MLK or the other Chicago Freedom Movement fighters?
First, I would say some of the people that were part of it, they're still alive today, except for Mr. Al Raby. Contact Jesse Jackson. He's very open and willing to talk about it. Dorothy Tillman, she always talked about the Chicago Freedom Movement, always. But talk to your parents. I talked to my mother was pregnant with me when it was the riots, and she was not too far from the West Side. She was around to talk about King's contributions when he came to Chicago. So I would just say, do extensive research, think beyond the March on Washington, and, learn as much as you can about what he did in Chicago.
Tammy, thank you so much for joining CityCast Chicago.
Thank you.
Before we get out of here, if you've been listening for a minute, you maybe heard me allude to the fact that we are coming up on 1,000 episodes. And it's coming up fast, y'all. And to celebrate, we've been putting together a list of 1,000 things we love about Chicago, but we need your help. We got like 500 of them, but we need your help to finish it out. Head to chicago.citycast.fm and fill out your survey and tell us what you love about Chicago. And it could be anything. The architecture, the roller skating, the music, it doesn't matter. That's 3 things right there. Of course, I can't let you go without some good news. This Saturday, a day of service honoring MLK is going down in Kenwood from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. There's a free MLK day of service up in Edgar's Grove from 10 a.m. to 2. And then there's the I Have a Dream exhibit in Westtown from 3 to 5 p.m. For more events, tap into our events calendar at chicago.citycast.fm. As always, we appreciate you for listening, reading, letting us know some of the things you love about Chicago, sharing this with your friends and family, and all of the above. We'll be back bright and early tomorrow. We'll talk to you then. Peace. What day is this, Kobe? What day is this, Kobe?